Hi, I am Tim Noah, senior writer for Slate Magazine.
And I am McArdle, the business and economics editor for The Atlantic.
And we are here to do Blogging Heads.
Woohoo!
I'm hoping that I have a better. I'm hoping that this picture now matches the standards of the American Society of Cinematographers. I've been fiddling around a little bit here.
I actually did one where, for whatever reason, just some weird shadow, I appeared to have a black eye, and I got several emails being like, "Is your fiance beating you?" There's help for that.
Yes, my significant other told me after my last one that I looked completely awful, and she gave me an earful about how.
Well, I mean,
she's actually an old hand at blogging heads. Rosa Brooks, but she doesn't do them anymore. She doesn't do them anymore because she's working for the Obama administration.
Sad loss.
But anyway, so her role now in blogging heads is strictly as a cinematographer.
Well, it's good though. I mean, I often look at these things and I'm like, do I really look that bad? So you don't.
Anyway, all right. Well, we should probably move on to more substantive topics now. Well, I guess it's inevitable that we're going to start with healthcare, which you and I have both been writing about quite a bit.
Yes. Let's see if we can't beat that horse just a little bit longer.
And I guess the question of the day is this compromise dead before we even find out exactly what it is? My impression is that it's losing altitude fast.
I'm sort of debating whether I should go out on a limb and make a bold prediction that has like a 10% chance of being correct, because if it hits, it'll be awesome, or if I should be conservative. But I'm kind of starting to think that health reform is dead. I'm actually
not just the compromise, but all of health reform.
The polls, every time they talk about it, the polls fall another 3 points, and at some point, I would say around 35%, it just becomes not possible. Even you can't pass something that's hated by 60% of the country and liked by 35% of it on a straight party line vote. Not if you want to survive the next round of elections.
Well, you are sticking your neck out. I will not go that far. I still think some form of health reform.
Well, let me clarify. I think something called health reform will pass, but something. I think it's looking more and more probable to me like it's going to be a very modest, either slight downward expansion of Medicare or upward expansion of Medicaid.
So you're skeptical about things like the individual mandate getting through and subsidies for health insurance getting through.
I feel crazy saying this. I'm really not sure about this. Like I've really been going back and forth on this for the past few days. But part of it is that the Democrats are like throwing these increasingly desperate things against the wall, right? Like Harry Reid just came out of committee and seems to have claimed that he had a compromise that he didn't have, in an effort to make this kind of sense of inevitability. And Nancy Pelosi said the same thing about getting a vote before Christmas, which is lunatic. And it's like, if you really, it's not like the members don't know this, right? They're not going to be fooled. So who are you trying to fool at this point?
Well, let's start with the narrow question of this compromise. The compromise was announced earlier this week. The idea, there were sort of 10 Senate members who were put together, 5 moderates and 5 liberals, and Harry Reid put them together, and they came up with an alternative to the public option. And the alternative had several components, of which the most interesting was a Medicare buy-in. People age 55 to 64 would be able to buy into Medicare. This prompted liberals like me to say, yippee, this is better than the public option, which I think immediately caused the moderates to move away from it, so I should have kept my big fat mouth shut. Ben Nelson was initially very warm to the idea. Now he seems to be backing away from it. Olympia Snowe was initially non-committal to negative. Now she says it's a deal breaker. Joe Lieberman initially said, well, maybe, but I have concerns. Now he says his concerns are mounting. So the Medicare buy-in, which in fact is more liberal than the public option, I think, in that it creates a more plausible path to single payer, and in fact Ted Kennedy favored it for that very reason. It's looking like the Medicare buy-in has gone from being a strangely easy sell to a very hard sell. Would you agree with what I'm saying?
Yeah, I view this as part of a broader issue that the Democrats have had, which is what I call the hunt for the magic pot of money that doesn't come attached to an angry interest group. Mm-hmm. And there isn't one, right? Like, you basically beaten about all you're going to get out of the insurers, because unfortunately they just didn't have that much money to start with. Everyone hates them, which is why they're convenient to bash. And they're probably the easiest group to get money out of, but they don't actually have that much money. The power is in the provider networks. The power is in the hospitals and the doctors. Well, unfortunately, the doctors and the hospitals are really popular. And so you can't do what you did with the insurance companies and be like, I'm going to take care of your doctor for you and make sure he doesn't prescribe any wasteful medicine. And that's essentially the Medicare buy-in.
Which is why the public option was such a hard sell.
Right.
The strong public option was a hard sell for this very reason.
But the Medicare thing is just the same thing. And so, to me, as soon as it happens...
The Medicare is hard on doctors, hard on hospitals, not necessarily so hard on insurers, because the price of these policies is likely to be astronomical.
It doesn't do anything to the insurers, right? It's not... Maybe it does a little bit, right? There's some argument that...
They are against it anyway.
Right. But they don't really want to insure the lucrative 55 to 64 market anyway.
Right.
Because it's...
I think they're worried about the long-term trend. If it is, in fact, path to single payer, obviously they don't like that.
Right, but they're not really the deal breaker. The deal breaker is the providers. The deal breaker is that what happened to Olympia Snow and what presumably happened to Joe Lieberman and Ben Nelson, which is that the AMA, I can only assume, that the AMA and the hospital lobbies started calling them and saying, oh no, you don't. And they turned around and said it. And it's actually true, right? Like, the healthcare reform is already, Pollster.com had it at 53 to 38 today. It cannot survive a nasty ad buy by the AMA or a hospital group.
Right. Because
they're popular. And if the AMA tells you it's a bad healthcare reform, then the support's going to fall even further.
So the Medicare buy-in went from being this very promising idea to...
I never thought it was going to happen, though, I have to say. Like, I just didn't... I was really skeptical.
Well, let's talk about some of the other components here. Another component, one that people like me were never terribly enthusiastic about, was expanding the federal health care program to include regular folks, although it sounds as though this would actually be separate. And this sounds like an idea that combines the worst of many different ideas. It would be managed by the Office of Personnel Management, which really has enough to do already without having to figure out how to run a national health care program for the entire country. It would allow members of Congress to say, we're giving you the same plan as members of Congress, but it wouldn't be the same plan as members of Congress. It for one thing, in the federal plans are the premiums are very heavily subsidized by the government to an extent that they wouldn't be, and also these are fairly lavish plans, and it just seems that any plans that would be offered to the general public would not be as generous. So it's kind of a mess of an idea. It used to be an idea that was very popular with conservatives. In fact, conservatives for years have been saying, let's replace Medicare with this, because it's publicly managed, but the policies are mostly private, not entirely, but mostly private. So conservatives have been very high on this, but of course the Heritage Foundation, which was very big on this idea back in the 1980s, is now dumping all over it because it's part of the Democrats' plan. So it's hard to know who's going to be in favor of it. That's my take on that.
I found the whole thing kind of puzzling, actually, because, first of all, there are obviously the complaints that you raised about the Office of Personnel Management is a pretty small agency. Right now, it's completely low profile, and I would argue that actually makes it probably better run. All of the relevant stakeholders have a strong voice in the process, so the federal employees unions are pretty powerful in this area, but no one else cares about it. No legislator comes along and gives your agency some impossible mandate that it can't possibly carry out because it's not public. It doesn't do him any good. So people, unless they actually have a reason to care about it, people pretty much ignore it. It has its issues. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it does a relatively good job. But there are genuine issues about how do you then expand it to a population that looks not very much at all like the federal workforce. It's younger, you don't have nearly as much control over it, and so on. So that's one problem. But the bigger problem was that as I understand the plan, it's supposed to supervise the creation of these nonprofit things that provide healthcare, right?
Right, it's supposed to come up with 2 of them.
Right, but who's going to run these? Who's going to volunteer? Right? Like, you have to get someone, if you're going to do nonprofits, you need input, you need capital and people from the private sector. And why are they doing this again? Like, what's the payoff? And this is the problem with co-ops, is that you would create them.
Well, if you're a public option advocate, what you're thinking is, great, let's have nobody volunteer, because then there's a trigger component here, and then we get our public option.
But
then
Olympia
the government
Snow...
gets to say, see, we tried.
But Olympia Snow's not actually an idiot. The Lieberman and Snow and the people who object to the public option, it's not like they can't sort of see that coming down the pike, right? All of these Trojan horses, I think that Pelosi and Reid have both done an incredible job getting this as far as it's come. Obviously I'm not necessarily for their efforts, but politically they've been incredibly skillful at delivering as much as they have. And I really think that any progressives or were criticizing them, you're not living in Sweden, and they've done an amazing job of getting as far as they have. But the problem is that there's only so far you can go with tricks like that, where we're going to do one thing in order to get to another place that relies on everyone else not kind of being able to see where this is all going. And unfortunately, in healthcare, first of all, it's just not that hard to see where things are going usually. And second of all, even if it is, there are a lot of lobbyists and think tankers, et cetera, who are dedicated to telling everyone exactly where this is going. And in some cases, right, not helping. Like a lot of pundits who are like, yes, Medicare is a great road to single payer. Like, if you want Medicare buy-in, shut up.
Right, but that's just...
no offense. But on the other hand, that's not really our job, right? Like, our job is to say what we think is happening, not to
No, it's my job. My job is to reveal the hidden motives even of the people on my side of the argument.
Right.
So if you're a liberal, where I think this is probably going to end up is Harry Reid is going to say, you know what, guys? We really tried. We tried to get you something, and guess what? You don't get anything. You don't get the public option. You don't get the Medicare buy-in. You don't get this thing that you didn't even especially want involving nonprofits. A couple of small things you may get. Actually, one not so small, which hasn't been discussed much, which is the medical loss ratio of 90%, which is actually kind of a big deal. Yeah,
and it's insane. Right? This is just like this lunatic number picked out of Jay Rockefeller's head that has no correspondence to reality.
I assume it's an opening bid. You start at 80 and then you bargain down to, you start at 90 and you bargain down to 85.
But even 85, then you're talking about my understanding is there's a lot of and I also think it's actually really misplaced. I think
we should also explain what the medical loss ratio is.
Do you want to take that, or?
Why don't you take it away?
Basically, this is the idea. It's actually funny because so many pundits have written this up as being like, the medical industry, the medical insurance industry even has a term for paying for people's health care. It's called the medical loss ratio. It's basically how much of their annual expenditures do they spend on paying for people's health care versus administrative costs.
Right.
And it varies. It can vary from, in the individual market, it tends to hover around 75% is my understanding. In the group market, it's much lower. But I don't think that even in the group market, no one, as far as I know, gets to 90. It's usually around 85, which means...
Kaiser gets to 90, but Kaiser is an HMO.
Right. And
Kaiser is also the most exemplary, probably the most exemplary private healthcare provider in the country.
But it's also the largest, and it has huge economies of scale that no one else is. I mean, it's in a huge. Its base is in a huge state, and it's just an enormous. So administrative costs tend to get lower as your organization gets. I mean, there's some countervailing pressures, but in general, your fixed overhead goes down the larger you are.
I actually think one plausible path to healthcare reform is just to send the Marines into Kaiser Permanente and say, we've captured you. You work for us now.
Well, why don't we just contract with Kaiser to provide healthcare for everyone in the country?
No, I'm not talking about contracting them. I'm talking about nationalizing them.
I don't think it would work quite as well if you nationalized it, because a lot of the stuff that Kaiser does, right, they would have to stop doing, because some lobby group would be like, why aren't you covering my special knee surgery that is only done by 2 surgeons in the United States and costs $900,000 in order to produce a 1% improvement in my walking ability or whatever.
Well, governments generally have a better track record on cost containment.
Well, it depends on how you... It depends on how you define cost containment. Now, governments have a much better record on controlling reimbursement rates because they just go and say, this is your reimbursement rate, take it or leave it.
Right.
They don't negotiate. But they have a worse record on controlling fraud. So
Sorry, what?
They have a worse record on controlling, as far as I understand it, the record of Medicaid especially, but also Medicare, at controlling overbilling is worse. And so, 6 of one, half of a dozen the other, right?
Encouraging, it gets complicated. But I'm sorry, I took you off the train of thought about medical loss ratio.
Well, I think that people are just too obsessed. And this is also, I wrote a post on this saying that there has been in sort of the past 5 to 10 years, especially on the left and in issues that appeal to the left. So the biggest areas you see this in is philanthropy and healthcare. There's been this growing obsession with overhead. And with ratcheting it down. And so charities are actually getting into a big problem because no one wants to give them money for overhead. Everyone wants to fund direct payments. And the problem is, the ideal overhead ratio is not 0 and it's not 1%. Administration helps you spend money effectively, and it varies by industry, it varies by organization, but it doesn't, the fact that you have the lowest administrative ratio does not mean that you're doing the most effective job. It does not mean that you're delivering the best care. It does not mean that you're delivering the best charity. But because it's a metric that we can actually see, people have become obsessed with it. And in fact, when you look at private insurers, according to the economists I've spoken to, what you see is the lower their overhead ratio, the more claims they pay. And so, that might be good, it might be bad, but it also means they're doing less cost control, which is the other side of, they're just doing less utilization control. So, in a time when we're also trying to do utilization control, you don't necessarily want to drive your overhead down to nothing, which is but it sounds
great,
right.
I certainly don't object to the idea of setting some benchmark and say, we don't care where you set it, just don't set it set it below.
But you can't take
90 might be too high, but
even 85, if that's the mean, you can't take the mean and tell the 50% or the median and tell the 50% of the people who are below the median that they have to suddenly be above the median. The fact that they're below the median may have more to do with the market they serve, or I'm not saying it does. Obviously, I think there are definitely administrative inefficiencies in healthcare, although my understanding is that they're actually more at the provider level than they are at the insurer level. Right. But that it's just setting some mindless number because it sounds good is not a good way to handle that problem, I think. And I think it's really dangerous because, one way to handle your overhead ratio is to inflate your costs, because now just start randomly paying out claims because now your overhead ratio is lower.
Right. But it is a troublesome, I think we don't have a lot of very hard information on this, but Wendell Potter, the industry whistleblower, at least claims that the medical loss ratio has been dropping steadily since the early 90s. And if that's true, then that is troubling, right?
Well, it depends. Is it a change? The medical loss, my understanding is that the medical loss ratio is much higher for certain markets, including the individual market and the small group market. So if you've been seeing a shift towards individual and small group, or you've been seeing a shift, if you've been seeing more big employers shift in self-insuring, you could just see a change in the makeup of the market that would explain that. I don't know. I mean, the answer is I don't know, and I'm sure there's waste. And I'm sure the profit margins of the industry that they report are actually below kind of average for a financial insurance
health
industry.
Insurance, right, is not the in general doesn't have the profit margins. There's a lot of other.
Which is what I would expect to see if the fall in the overhead in the medical loss ratio were driven by some sort of a search for profits. Were driven by something other than some sort of administrative need that the industry has. But
in any case, one thing we do agree on is that 90% they're unlikely to get the 90%
yes.
either. Let's see what else was on the list. An expansion of the CHIP program, which is a money saver. Actually, one of the bizarre ironies of health reform is that they keep discovering that every time you herd a bunch of people into a government program, you're spending less money than if you were herding them into the exchanges, which are supposed to be the big idea of health reform.
Yeah, but some of them are like Medicaid reimbursement rates are absurdly low. And I think everyone left and right agrees that as far as I can tell, the only way that like the non-specialists make any money in Medicare is by committing fraud.
But in CHIP, apparently, Senator Rockefeller was pushing this CHIP expansion, and his main concern here is not to save money, but quality of care. Now, he may be mistaken, but his motive, at least, is that he believes that kids will get better care in the CHIP program. And if he's right about that, then that is kind of a damning thing to say about these new market-based plans.
I don't know. I think we don't know. There's no way of knowing what's more cost-effective, the exchanges or CHIP, until. But I mean, there is this problem of there's already in a lot of markets there's kind of saturation of the number of doctors who are willing to take Medicaid reimbursements, right?
But that's definitely true of Medicaid,
right? But CHIP works off of, as I understand. Am I wrong with this?
Similar, yeah.
My understanding is they basically work off the Medicaid reimbursement rates, not the Medicare reimbursement rates.
Right, but for some reason you don't hear as many horror stories about CHIP, and I don't understand why.
Well, pediatricians have more surplus capacity than most other professions right now. That may change, but but the problem is that there's just saturation of doctors who either can or are willing to care for patients at those reimbursement rates. And indeed, like they really do in New York, it's pretty widely known that the way that the doctors who are on Medicaid make money, and New York's actually relatively generous, is to overbill and drive a lot of volume. And also the teaching hospitals subsidize it because it gives them free patients, right? They're willing to throw money there because then they have poor people that their students can experiment on. But it's not a way that you can sort of drive. The more people you push into that program, the more problems you have, and the more sort of rationing you have in that little subsector. Just because you already see this: doctors who won't take Medicaid, specialists who won't take Medicaid. People having a hard time finding doctors who will accept their insurance other than the local hospitals.
All right. Well, at any rate, this is one that liberals might get. If your argument is correct, they might regret that they win this one. But there isn't much to this compromise that it looks like Reid is going to be able to deliver on. So it seems as though liberals will basically be faced with the reality they're not getting a public option. They're not getting much in the way of a substitute for the public option. And therefore they just have to ask themselves, is the rest of the bill worth supporting? My guess is that they will conclude, yes, it is, because it still imposes regulations on insurers that liberals are in favor of. It extends lots of subsidies for the purchase of health insurance. It expands Medicaid substantially, expands CHIP. So I think that any threats on the left to abandon health reform are empty. On the other hand, I think threats by moderates and conservatives to abandon health reform are extremely plausible.
Yes, and I think that that's been the core. This is sort of the thing I haven't really understood about the abortion stuff, because maybe I'm crazy, but it seems pretty clear to me that you're going to get Stupak-like language very close to what Stupak got in the final bill. Why? Because the pro-choicers, the pro-lifers will walk away, right? This is the deal breaker for them. Now, who in the pro-choice caucus is going to walk away and say, you know what, I don't want to do health care because it's not letting me expand the number of women who can get subsidized abortions?
Although what's baffling to me, and what is also completely contrary to all the expert opinion after the vote on the Stupak amendment, is, everyone is saying, well, the Senate is more conservative than the House. If it passed the House, it's certainly going to pass the Senate. And it didn't pass the Senate. It's strange that the holdup here appears to be in the House, and it's hard to know how that's going to play out.
There are more vulnerable members in the House. There are more members who really could lose their seat if they pass this thing. And, there are senators who could. Harry Reid may lose his seat over this. But there are more people in the House who are really close to an election where they could go down. And if you're in a heavily pro-life district, you're just not going to vote for something that the National Right to Life Committee can send out a mailer saying he voted to expand federal funding for abortion.
Well, I think it's complicated. I think it's more complicated than that, because you also have a very, very substantial constituency that wants health reform. I mean, these are often the same folks. They're the same kind of working class voters who are very pro-life or also very pro-health reform.
The problem is that it's, this is one of the things that, I don't know about you. I'm sort of from the Irish Catholic community, but not myself Catholic. And there's something that I have arguments with I'm pro-choice, so I'm not really having this argument on my own behalf. But where people are like, well, the Catholic Church cares about healthcare too. And they do, but it's not even a question about which wins. Because if you look at it, even the most sort of left-wing activist derived number estimate of how many people die from lack of healthcare every year, is just dwarfed by the number of abortions in the country. Absolutely, by an order of magnitude, dwarfed. And so, there's no question that you're going to fight the one for, if you think that fetuses are human beings, you're going to fight the one before you fight the other. And that's the core problem that I actually do think a lot of progressives don't get. And so they attack on the wrong fronts. They just, they fight too hard for things that they can't get because they don't understand the kind of logic that's driving. Pro-life voters are really, really animated on this thing, and they're absolutely they're not going to back down. And if it's a choice between healthcare reform and funding abortions and theoretically increasing the number of abortions, you're not going to do it. It's just kind of a no-brainer for a lot of them, and that's the opposition that they're facing. And also, a lot of these guys are in districts that aren't Democratic and aren't filled with working-class Catholic voters who kind of like healthcare reform and hate abortion. A lot of them are in Republican-leaning districts who got swept in because everyone hated George Bush.
Right. Well, I have to say I honestly don't know. I think this will play out. But let's change the subject. One last healthcare discussion. I found myself wondering, because you are. Am I correct to describe you as a libertarian?
Yeah.
Prescription drug imports. Complicated question for a libertarian. Right now, the health bill is stalled in the Senate because Byron Dorgan is pressing an amendment that looks like it could pass if they had the vote right now, which is why Harry Reid is not allowing a vote right now. This is an amendment that would allow for the importation of prescription drugs, something that Obama actually came out in favor of during the 2008 presidential election. He has since changed his mind, possibly on the merits, but it's also true that he cut a deal, the White House cut a deal with Big Pharma to support the bill, and Billy Tuzzin says this was part of it. That they would oppose prescription drug importation. It's not clear it was explicitly part of it, but it's certainly true that around the same time, the White House did back away from that position, and now Peggy Hamburg, the FDA commissioner, has sent a letter to Congress saying we do not support this amendment. It's an interesting issue. My thoughts about it are mostly political, which is that when you're trying to pass health care reform, you don't want to, at the same time, try and restructure the entire pricing mechanism of the drug industry. Fight one battle at a time. But I'm curious, are you for this or against it?
I'm against it. There are libertarians who are for it. I think that there are arguments. There's two classes. They're just like, they're for it, and that's it. And, but then there are people who are like, well, it would force Canada to pay more of the costs of drug development. No, it wouldn't. There's no way to force Canada to pay more of the costs of drug development than they do. There's no reason that this would enable, pharmaceutical companies bargain really hard with the Canadian government now. It's not like they don't want extra money if it's on the table. The deal they have with the Canadian government now is the deal they got after bargaining. Reimportation is not going to give them any bargaining power. So no, it wouldn't. It would force down prices in the U.S. I'm harder core on intellectual property than most libertarians are. I think that all of the sort of the arguments you have about how it's different because it's not excludable, it's not rival. I can listen to my MP3 and that doesn't really change your ability to listen to an MP3. Are fairly silly and really underweight the fact that property rights have evolved over a long time. They did not.
Although it's tricky in this case because here the prices are largely determined not by the drug industry but by government.
Right. Well, their argument is that intellectual property is just different, and they're usually they are less interested in protecting intellectual property rights than other kind of property rights. I think this is a stupid distinction, and it really underweights the fact that property rights are institutional arrangements that have evolved over a long time because they work and they enable societies to allocate resources efficiently. They did not spring full grown out of the head of Zeus. In some sort of like natural law ideal form that tells us what is and is not something that should be property. But that's neither here nor there. I think
do you agree with the conservative argument that if you did, that the effect would be not to lower prices in the U.S., but to raise prices in third world countries? You do not agree with that?
No, I do not agree with that. I think that the effect would be to lower prices in the U.S. I've had this discussion with a lot of people. It surprises me how many people think that there is some way by the U.S. affecting its pricing environment to somehow force Europe or Canada or other countries to raise their prices. There isn't. We have no ability to alter that. Nothing that we do is going to make... Well, there actually are some things we have done, right? The reason that pharmaceutical companies apparently often do not sell drugs at a discount in third world countries is precisely this kind of faux moral outrage you get from senators who say, well, it only costs 3 cents in Africa, and then so they stop selling it for 3 cents in Africa so that they don't have to answer those questions. I think that we get value largely for our pharmaceutical money. That if we didn't get value, no one would care. In fact, what people are outraged about is that they really like these drugs and they're really great and they want to get them. And they resent that they cost a lot. But the fact is, it's obviously worth what you're paying. And all this is now is haggling. I don't feel like I should have to pay this much.
Except, this gets us back to the, question of medical services. Are they really comparable to other goods that you buy?
Why is it different from food? Food's really great and even more necessary than drugs. But I don't think that I have a right to buy food for whatever I think I would like to pay for it. I have to pay what the producer thinks it costs them to make it, and the price.
You might think that if food were a whole lot more expensive than it really is. It doesn't come up as a practical matter because food is cheap.
But the reason
Drugs are
it's cheap,
expensive.
but the reason that we have so much of it is precisely that markets set these prices rather than trying to do it by command and control. Markets where prices are set by command and control are, in basically every case, inferior. They don't do as good a job at matching the supply of things to the demand. And that's sort of the core issue here is, do we want to send a signal to lower the supply of drugs, which is what we would be doing if we lowered prices. That is.
Well, if you're Harry Reid, what do you do? What do you do under this circumstance politically?
I let it drag out until after Christmas and hope it dies. Maybe I threaten Byron Dorgan and say, like, "Are you on crack? Please stop." Because the problem is they can't lose pharma. They can't lose anyone at this point. They cannot afford to have any of these big industry lobbies. They're already at 38%. They can't.
See, I'm not against them alienating pharma.
I'm just talking politically.
In principle, I just think that they should, if they're going to alienate pharma, they should do it not over this issue, but over the Medicare pricing issue.
But politically, they can't alienate anyone at this point. They cannot lose a single interest group because any group out there running more negative ads against this, no one's running that many negative ads right now, right?
But if you do it right before you pass the bill, and then the bill's passed, then there's nothing to run ads against, right?
Right, but they still have time. All of these guys have they have big war chests, and they are sitting on the side because they were bought off. It's not that they're not sitting on the sidelines because they don't have. I guarantee you that AHIP and Pharma and all of these other players, they have ads made and ready to go. All they are waiting for is a deal breaker, right? And then they're going to go. They will come out against it if it takes too much from them. They're willing to deal because they're afraid of something worse happening, right? Like Pharma's cutting deals, AHIP, the insurance industry is cutting deals because they're hoping to get something out of it. Pharma expects to benefit from more customers. Insurance expects to benefit from more customers. The providers do as well. But if you play too much with their existing cash flows, they will fall out of the coalition. They will come out, instead of just lobbying behind your back, right? They're going to come out and actively try to defeat the bill. When you've got
but we don't know. We don't actually know where their breaking point is. My guess is that
pharma reimportation. I guarantee you, pharmaceutical reimportation is the breaking point. Pharma will not sit still for it.
I think that's probably right. I'm more curious about this. This pricing issue concerns the government's ability to force volume discounts on drug prices. They've already
got like a 50% discount. How big a discount?
They do get a discount already, but they don't have the same discounting ability that the Medicaid program has.
No, but one of the bills has for the donut hole. Right, they've got a 50% discount on drugs for seniors who are in the donut hole. How much more of a discount? How much more do you want Pharma to give back? Do you want them to give you their drugs for free? Because they're not going to.
Right. Surely there is some point in between those two extremes. But in any case, we have hashed out health reform. We probably drive our masters crazy if we talk about it much longer. We should move to something more edifying, like Baucus Gate. You have called for Max Baucus's resignation. Were you serious about that?
I am,
and
not because I also think David Vitter, maybe not David Vitter, because I don't think prostitution should be illegal, but I think John Ensign should have resigned. I generally think that the forcing politicians who try to use their powers to help out their paramours just it's the resignation is an underused tool in that circumstance. And ultimately that was what I thought Jim McGreevy's crime was, right? It's really sick. I think it's a terrible thing that he did to his wife. And he should never have married her, obviously. But I think the real crime was that he stuck his boyfriend, in state office in a world. Right.
Well, we should explain what Baucus did. Max Baucus, it turned out that he recommended his girlfriend, now live-in girlfriend, for a U.S. attorney job, and apparently, initially his story was, well, we thought better of it, and she withdrew. Then we found out that she thought better of it because the Missoula'n had phoned Baucus and inquired about this, and they realized they were about to get hit with a negative story. Right. The story, for some mysterious reason, never ran. And Politico has also reported that she got a $14,000 raise. Not clear whether that's a raise she wouldn't have gotten anyway. And somewhat more damning, she went on a taxpayer-funded trip with Baucus,
which is not something that you're
area of expertise.
Yes. It seems clear to me that he took his girlfriend along on a like a pretty expensive junket. It was like a $14,000 per person junket. And that he tried to get her appointed a U.S. attorney. And that shouldn't happen. And, it's not that, and people have said, well, all sorts of stuff goes on, and like it does, and I think we should expose those people and force them to resign more often. It's not an excuse for Baucus. This is not something that's like, it has to happen. Like, the system can't function unless we can all appoint our significant others to high office. Like when I started...
I must say though, I do bridle at if Baucus were to resign, I would bridle at the double standard. Given
but I actually don't think
David Vitter did not resign. I mean, you may think that prostitution shouldn't be a crime, but surely you also recognize that
but he's not in the leadership.
And members of Congress shouldn't be going around breaking the law, no matter what it is.
Oh, I quite agree. But he's not in the leadership.
Baucus isn't in the leadership either. He's just chairman of the finance committee.
But that's part of the leadership, right? That is part of he's central to the healthcare reform. Right, he's a central part of the major reforms that you're trying to do.
3 weeks from now, when health reform is over, he just goes back to being a regular schmuck like everybody else.
But here's what I don't understand: y'all don't even like him, right? Everyone hates him. He's going to be replaced by a Democrat. Why not kick him? Why not show him the door when you have a chance?
Well, I don't know. I rather than say I think he should go, I must say I am surprised and shocked that he did this. This does seem a fairly elementary thing.
But Livingston and Hyde did have to resign. They were forced. Livingston and Hyde and Trent Lott were forced out by their own party. They were told it is time. You may no longer have an important position among us. If you want to stay and if you want to hang out.
Well, that was because they had to take one for the team so they could bring down Clinton. That was a different
They'd already
context.
brought down Clinton.
No. Livingston stepped down before I guess...
No, I don't think so.
After the impeachment vote, but it was before the vote in the Senate. So it was just sort of bad for Republicans generally.
But he was in the House.
He was not. He was in a different body, but yes. Yeah. But I think they recognized that they couldn't. That they would diminish their chances in the Senate, where they lost anyway.
Lot was, people realized, and this is not even they don't have any authority to remove Baucus from the Senate. They can't force him out, right? But Lott was removed from the leadership because everyone knew, I'm not claiming the Republicans have any sort of superior virtue. I think anyone who walks around saying that one party or the other is filled with just nicer people who have better ethics, etc., is just not spent any time at all watching the news. But the Republicans, I think, do have actually a better sense of this person's really hurting us, and they.
Right, well, the Lott case is interesting. I actually played a role in the Lott thing. I wrote about it.
I remember this.
And linked to the speech, which Lott then wrote later in the book. He thought that was really dirty pool. that after he had praised that campaign, that I would actually be so underhanded as to provide historical evidence of what was said in that campaign.
But I was
what was not only said in that campaign, what is the most well-known thing that was said in that campaign.
I applaud you. I think,
but I was not calling for his resignation. Of course, I thought it was great that Republicans were being exposed for I was one of those people who thought, yeah, let him sort of limp along. That'd be.
But then they went and exposed themselves as people who will take out the guy who doesn't have any problem praising racism. They took him down, and the Democrats have not done this to any major leader that I can think of. They did not say and conservative bloggers were calling for his head, conservative columnists were calling for his head. He had no one on their side saying, well, let's just kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. It's, everyone was
fairness, Democrats have had a deficit of scandals lately. There have been a whole lot more scandals on the Republican side.
Charlie Rangel?
Few years. Charlie Rangel was one, but look who went after Charlie Rangel, the liberal New York Times.
But the leadership is protecting him. I'm from New York, and everyone I know in New York is just and I'm from very near his district. Everyone I know is shocked and horrified that this guy is still in the House, much less in a leadership position.
Ted Kennedy sort of did the same thing not long after, except the sum was about twice as much. And he didn't do it personally. It was done on his behalf for this institute.
I am not a Ted Kennedy fan, so this is not likely to.
But I wrote the Globe, actually, to its great credit, wrote about this, and then I picked it up, and nobody else wanted to touch it because he was dying. But the fact of the matter was he was allowing some fairly disgraceful shakedowns to be occurring in his name.
that somehow completely does not surprise me. But he, like the sort of old city politicians, there's just and he comes out of, Ted Kennedy is not himself a city politician, but he comes out of that Boston political machine. Like that's
what astonished me was that a man like Ted Kennedy, who has such a, whether you love him or hate him, he has such a pronounced legacy on the shape of American life, that he would somehow feel that he needs to have a replica of the Senate built at Columbia Point in Boston in order for people to remember him. Struck me as peculiar. I mean, that's really the larger story. All these members of Congress want these public affairs institutes built in their name, and really, what's the demand for public affairs institutes around the country?
Yeah, I used to refer to these things as like the Trent Lott Memorial Hogback Research Project at Ole Miss.
Right.
I know that actually exists, but like all of these ridiculous things named after senators and House members so that they can feel like someone will remember who they were. And this is
shakedowns
ridiculous.
Shakedowns in order to create institutions that will promote preposterous high-mindedness.
Right, but most of us have gone to... The sad thing is that in 100 years, no one is going to know who Ted Kennedy was, probably. Maybe they will, but they're not going to...
I disagree with it. I think they will know who Ted Kennedy is. They may not remember who Charlie Rangel was.
Do you really think... Because, how many people know the names of even incredibly influential, important senators from 1900?
People know who Daniel Webster was.
Right, but that's 200 years ago, and that's one guy.
Right, well, I think Ted Kennedy has a good chance of being that one guy for the 20th century.
Really?
But, he had a huge impact. I actually wrote a piece when he died saying that he actually had a much greater impact on American life than either of his brothers. In terms of concrete changes to laws and the well-being of many people, and that it was on a less exalted plane perhaps, but it was much more extensive.
I'm not disagreeing with you on his impact. I'm just saying that I do not think that America long remembers their senators or House representatives. Like, the only reason anyone knows, they know the people, they know the names of maybe 3 legislators from the 19th century. It's just tiny. They just don't. These people fall away, and what we remember is the presidents.
I just saw a poll that said that it's actually, if you want to look at their polls that sort of demonstrate dismal understanding of American history, there was a poll asking people who said, from each according, to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and more people said either George Washington or Barack Obama than Marx and Engels.
I guess I would say that, I will tell my own amusing New York City argument. An anecdote is I grew up in Manhattan, and for people who are familiar with New York City, there is a fairly major high artery running through the city called the Major Deacon. And for years, I thought that there was a minor Deacon somewhere. And it turns out that no, Major Deacon was a guy. He was a public works commissioner in, I think, the 19th century, late 19th century, I believe. Anyway,
I've never known who Major Deacon was.
Yes, well, he ran on, he ended up on a list. They have a list of people after whom streets should be named in New York. And at least I was told this story. I have to say, I've never actually researched this, but I assume that the source, the professor who told me this in college, was not just making it up and lying to me. So he went on this list, and it turned in a little street, I think in the Bronx, was named after him. And then they turned it eventually, like it got expanded a little bit, and then it got turned into the Major Deegan. And that's right, but who knows who Major Deegan was? And I say the name Major Deegan, if you're in New York and you drive at all, you say the name Major Deegan once a week, and no one I've ever met knows who he was. And so I think all of these public affairs, even if you got all of these institutes, how many of the buildings in your college did you know who they were named after?
Well, Ted Kennedy is no Major Deegan.
No, I don't think he is, but I just think that, like, in 100 years...
Will they remember who Ayn Rand was? Now I'm really getting...
Maybe. But I don't, like, I have no investment in someone remembering who... I think I like Ayn Rand's novels for beach reading, but I also am a big fan of Soviet realist fiction, so... I like Chinese communist propaganda films, so I'm probably not the right person to ask about. But, like, I'm not an Ayn Rand sort of... Ayn Rand is the best novelist on the planet kind of person. I read her when I'm at the beach because it's really portable. You could take one book and have an entire day's worth of reading. But
really badly written, though. I mean, it gives you a headache, I think.
Well, it depends on the book. Actually, like her first novel is actually quite good.
I've heard that, yeah.
We the Living. It's because it actually has real people in it rather than these sort of crazy automatons who act in no way that any real human being has ever acted, including Ayn Rand. But she actually, like, the interesting thing is she got a bunch of stuff right about, like, industrial organization. She really should have been, like, the Gilbraiths or someone going around and she should have been a management consultant, I think, actually. That's where, actually, the greatest strength of her books is sort of understanding how all these little pieces of industries fit together into a big jigsaw. Neither here nor there. I'm not slamming Ted Kennedy. I'm really not. It's just nothing to do with the titanicness of his achievement. Only that, like, Americans, we barely remember who was president. Frankly, I doubt most of the people in the country could name all of the presidents from the 19th century, much less any of our legislators. And I have a feeling
there's that very treacherous period in the latter half of the 19th century, in particular.
Oh, it's like Cleveland and Garfield and Rutherford.
It gets really, you get into Chester Arthur territory. You're starting to have some difficulty.
Indeed.
Well, I think we have covered all the issues we had promised to, and we've gone about an hour. This has been a fun conversation.
Yes, I've enjoyed it very much.
And we will, I guess, just have to wait and see what happens to healthcare reform.
Yes, I should say, like, I'm really not confident of this assessment. I just, I don't see, they don't have quite enough money to do what they want, and they can't seem to find any more.
Right.
And, like, that's the, I think they've exhausted all of the imaginative ways to find, like, a little extra money to get where they're trying to go. But we'll see. Well,
except this isn't really about it. That's one thing I would disagree with you about. This compromise is not about getting extra money because it's really about providing something that can fill the ideological gap of the public option. The Medicare buy-in is not really about saving money, I don't think. In fact, we're not even totally sure whether it would spend money. There are so many variables there that it's hard to know whether it would cost money, cost the government money or not. On the one hand, it would allow them to cut fees to doctors and hospitals, but on the other hand, this is a group that's really expensive to insure because they get sick and die a lot. So I really think what this compromise is about is I think they've got the money covered without this. You may or may not agree with the CBO estimates, but the CB estimates, I think, give them all the political cover they need to pass the bill without the public option.
I was saying something a little bit different, which is that I think of one of the things that they want to do is to give the left wing of their party something that kind of looks like it's going to single payer, or might, in some imaginary universe far in the future, go to single payer, right? But that's expensive because the way you get there is, the easiest way to get there is to buy off the interest groups. You give them something else. But they don't have the money to buy off the interest groups. So there's this whole package of stuff they want to do, and all of it at this point seems to hang together, and it's really hard to pass it without any of the options, but they don't have enough money to buy off all the interest groups that they need to in order to get that package passed.
You have a much more transactional notion of these things than I do. But in any case, we agree that they're not going to get the public option. I think Sherrod Brown and company are going to say, we're really sorry that we're not getting any of the things we asked for or their equivalents, but I kind of have to vote for this bill anyway. What I don't think is going to happen is, what remains to be seen, I should say, is whether the moderates can be won over. And no, I actually think the odds are that some version of health reform will pass, but I'm not sure how much more is going to get whacked out before it does.
Well, I guess we will see. I think you're right with a 45% chance, but depending on how you define some version of it, with an 80% chance, depending on how you define some version. But there's only one way to find out.
They may well pass a law saying, that America Beautiful is the new national anthem, and that's healthcare reform.
That singing is it promotes community. It gets your lungs working. It is very healthy. In fact, I think we should close by singing America the Beautiful.
Well, I can't, unfortunately. I can't sing. But thanks so much, Megan, and this was enjoyable.
Yes, it was great fun. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye, Internet.